That is not a dog. I am Amanda Willis. I live in a small town in the northern part of Michigan in a small cabin in the woods. Living in the woods in a secluded area is tough and often leaves people feeling lonely. As a result, I decided to go to my local shelter and adopt a dog. I figured I lived in a secluded area with lots of land and forest for the dog to run around. I also worked mostly from home, giving me the free time needed to take care of a dog. At the local shelter, I noticed nothing odd. It was the normal barks and whimpers of dogs, wagging their tails excitedly to leave their kennels. I'll be honest, I always hated going to animal shelters. Seeing all the animals, some cowering, and some begging to be let out, always filled my heart with sorrow. I was sick of the loneliness though, and to be completely honest, I am not the biggest people person. So a dog it was. I had always wanted a dog as a kid and loved every dog I was allowed to pet. My parents could never afford one, and I never got around to getting one as an adult. I was most interested in getting a larger dog, one who would enjoy running around my land and perhaps even go on long walks with me. Most of the dogs just didn't appeal to me until I came across a large, scrawny black and white mutt. I'm not the greatest with dog breeds, but I had guessed possibly Border Collie, Greyhound, and perhaps a little bit of Pit Bull. The shelter labeled the dog as a Border Collie mix. The dog had a longer snout, blockier head, long thin legs, and a leaner build. He had half-pricked ears, one slightly floppier than the other. His eyes were an icy shade of blue, but one had brown mixed in. He was stunning. I knelt beside the cage and he wagged his tail and hesitantly got up and approached. His movements were off. It was like that of a creature not quite used to walking on four legs. Like a human trying to walk on four legs. "Who's this guy?" I had asked the worker who had accompanied me into the kennel room. "Oh, him," she had said, nervously. "He's a dog we recently took in, found by some stranger on the side of the street. No sign of a microchip and no one has taken him in." But the lady had trailed off, clearly uncertain whether to say something. "What about him?" I had asked. "He acts a little weird. Doesn't play with the other dogs. Heck, the other dogs seem scared of him. Whenever he approaches even the friendliest dogs we have at the shelter, he sends them running away, barking and snarling, hackles raised and trembling. He's been returned 5 times in the month we have had him. All without notice. The owners always return looking nervous and never give us a clear answer." The shelter worker stuttered out her reply. At that moment I felt bad for the poor boy. It wasn't his fault, but I guess I should have heeded the warnings. I adopted him and took him home that day, and things got weirder each day. On the way home, I took him to the local pet store, a small family-owned business, on a leash. Every dog that came across him lunged and barked, cowering behind their owners. Every dog, no matter the breed or size. Even a guide dog I had frequently met when I went into town had lost it. That dog was the most stable ever, never barking or showing a speck of fear or aggression to anyone. It was odd, but I just figured it was nothing. Perhaps the normal. I had never owned a dog before, so I didn't question it. I had, jokingly at the time, named him Cujo after the rabid Saint Bernard in Pet Cemetery. Now I'm afraid that it isn't a joke anymore. The first odd behavior I noticed was the way he seemed to stare deep into nothingness. I had taken him to the vet, concerned about some brain problem, but there was nothing. He was, as the vet said, healthy as a horse. I awoke some nights to him on top of the bed, his icy blue eyes staring deep into my soul. His eyes some days were too human-looking. They weren't the normal eyes of a dog, even for the ones that have blue eyes. Everything went silent when we entered the woods together. Birds flew away. Crickets stopped chirping. Not a single snap of the twig in the distance. Just complete dead silence. His eyes appeared to glow in the dark, a piercing blue through the dark of night. The experience that confirmed my theory was after a month of owning Cujo. The name had stuck. I awoke at night to a strange silence that had fallen across the house. I got up, my throat dry, to get a drink of water. The house was dead silent. Not even the house settling was heard. My heart hammered in my chest as I headed for the kitchen. A crunch, snap, crack was heard from the direction of the kitchen. "Cujo?" I called out, hesitantly, and the noises stopped. I entered the kitchen to see Cujo standing on his back legs, his arms positioned weirdly, and the worst part about it, His head was turned around, so he was staring at him. His back facing me, but his head was swiveled around. His mouth was partially open, drool dripping from his mouth. I let out a scream and sprinted to my room. The next morning when I crept out, Cujo came to me with a wagging tail, holding something in his mouth. He dropped it at my feet and I nearly gagged as the body of a dismembered squirrel landed at my feet, its intestines leaking from his body. I found many more of those that day of many different animals. Even a deer he had somehow brought into the house. The smell of blood and decay was evident even after I scrubbed the house from head to toe. At that point, I didn't know what to do. I was terrified of him, but I didn't want to return him. What would I even tell them? Plus, he wasn't a bad companion outside of those incidents. The worst experience of all was when I awoke, facing the ceiling. I didn't open my eyes right away, but I felt something dripping onto my face. I groaned and wiped the liquid away. I opened my eyes and let out a scream. Cujo was on the ceiling. His jaw stretched out so wide it looked to be dislocated. He was perched on the ceiling, his body twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His eyes were glowing, not a faint glow, but a full-blown glow that illuminated the whole room. A light blue glow. His teeth were sharper and his nails were gnarled claws, digging into the ceiling. Bits of plaster fell onto my face. I froze and couldn't move. I was so terrified I was frozen out of fear. The creature above came to change, its face fading from one of a dog's into one that is almost human. Its fur and flesh fell away, turning into the skin, hair sprouting from its head. The creature looked like me, except it was wrong. Some things weren't right. Its eyes were slightly too close, nails a little too sharp, and nose the wrong shape. To the blind eye, it was me though. It took one of its bony arms and hit me as hard as he could. I awoke with chains connecting me to the wall. No matter how hard I tugged or shifted them, I couldn't figure out a way to unlock them. It was like the creature welded them to my legs. I could hardly even move. I'm typing this out on the last of my phone battery. No one is picking up my calls and I'm afraid of what is to come. I came with a warning. There is someone out there pretending to be me. If you meet someone with long brown hair with green eyes that seem a little too close claiming to be Amanda Willis, that is not me. I am locked in a basement, chains welded to my legs. I fear I may die down here and that thing is going to take my place. I'm afraid it has already hurt people. If you adopt a dog from a local shelter and he displays any unusual behavior or appears wrong in any way, return the dog and get rid of it as soon as you can. That is not a dog. Autopsying a pregnant woman, and it keeps getting stranger. I knew her. In all my years of work, I've developed a strange relationship with death. I see it as something purely physical. The body in front of me is just an organism who's stopped living. That's all that it is. And yet, it took me by surprise to have her on my table. I'd seen her around the hospital before, excited, glowing, talking about what her life would look from now on. She was a bit distracted sometimes, saying that great things were coming, but I didn't expect her to die right before giving birth. She was found drowned in her own home, with writings on her wrists and on the back of her neck, and she'd been laying in her bathtub for days before her neighbor found her. She had no husband, no relatives. They expected me to rule it as a suicide. I didn't believe that since it made no sense. Why would she kill herself right before giving birth? Right before becoming a mother? A thing she'd been so excited about? I'd been called in the middle of the night to work on her. They said her body was already in a pretty fragile state, and I needed to be precise and fast before they could wrap this tragedy up. I won't weight you down with all the gory details. I'll just go over the process really fast so that you'll get an idea of what I do. First came some of the paperwork and observations, along with the external examination and photographs. I didn't notice anything besides the obvious signs of drowning and damage done by the 3 days spent in the bathtub. Although, if I'm being honest, but that might have been just me, I thought that the skin surrounding the writing, wrists, neck was lighter than the rest and harder. Next came the internal examination. I'd been plagued by a wave of sadness, not wanting to move on with the procedure, but I tensed up and kept on working. Again, the usual signs of drowning. I froze with the instruments in hand. I was the only one in the morgue, or at least the only one alive. And it might have been the lack of sleep or the general eerie atmosphere that was making me feel unsure of what I was seeing. There was no earthly way she could have made those carvings on her ribs. Tiny carvings of the same symbols. My throat was dry, which made me feel like I was choking on air, and suddenly the collar of my scrub felt too tight for me. It wasn't my imagination. Her ribs were covered in these carvings. Could it be some bone-eating bacteria? I knew it was pointless to even ask that question because I knew it wasn't. I took out my phone to take a close-up of the ribs. I know that wasn't too professional, but I had no choice. The moment I took the picture, something clattered in the distance. I looked up to the door to the hallway. No one should be here. I took a sharp breath and carefully put my gloves back on, feeling the blood slowly drain from my face as I worked my way down to her amniotic sac. I was expecting to see something that would make my skin crawl, and I knew that no matter how hard I braced myself, it would still hit me hard. When I opened it, it was empty. There were no signs of a fetus. It was as if it had just disappeared, leaving her placenta and the umbilical cord behind, intact. There was no baby there. I stepped back from her and took off my gloves. I rubbed my eyes. That had to be impossible. Her tummy had been perfectly round, and I'm pretty sure there would have been signs if she'd given birth before or after dying. It was inhumane, unnatural. Everything indicating a pregnancy existed, all except for the baby. I carefully closed her up, trying not to think about the missing baby and the symbols, then filled the report. I wrote suicide on it. I wasn't 100% sure of that. I didn't need to be. They'd been clear with the instructions. Just get it done. Fast. I creaked the door open and peered into the hallway. The clattering had come from the supply room, and I hadn't heard the door open or close, so what had done it was still there. I approached it slowly, holding my breath, as if I were afraid to make a sound. I placed my hand on the doorknob and twisted. Click. It was locked. On the inside. I knocked. "Hey!" I whispered, "Is anyone there?" What followed was an unusual sound. Something like someone sucking the air through their teeth. I looked back to the hallway, ending with the morgue. The door was swinging open. I couldn't remember if I'd closed it or not, and I didn't want to. I decided my job was finished there. I closed up and got into my car, then drove home in silence. I live alone, so me coming home at 3 a.m. would not disturb anyone. After doing my night routine and going to bed, I found myself twisting and turning, strange dreams pressing onto me, like the ones you have when you have a fever. I thought I heard a cry at one point until I realized it had been my own. I opened my eyes after what seemed like minutes to discover it was a little over 6 a.m. In the soft glow of the morning, my window had fogged up a bit, and I couldn't help but stare, perplexed, at the fresh print of a child's hand on inside of the glass. Frizzy's Wonderful Circus. The car door slammed shut behind me as I stared at the faded sign. The sign had once said Frizzy's Wonderful Circus, now laid in disrepair. I sighed. The place of my childhood stood in complete disrepair. Frizzy's Wonderful Circus, the small-town middle-of-nowhere version of Chuck E. Cheese. My parents would drive me here whenever I got too rowdy to stay on the farm. It even got to the point where I would do it on purpose just to get a trip here. The circus consisted of Frizzy, the leader who was a white and black rabbit, Sassy, a fluffy red, black, and white calico cat, Pogo, a black and white border collie with ice blue eyes, Izzy, a gray elephant with large gray ears with large green eyes, Tigris, a stunning tiger with piercing amber eyes, and Everest, an Arctic fox with pale blue eyes. When I was a kid, Sassy always ended up as my favorite. Her sassy attitude and her dry jokes were the laugh of the crowd. Pogo had always scared me though, his blue eyes looking slightly too human and his sharp voice and rowdy personality causing me to scream and sob the first time he appeared, clinging to my parents as they tried to console me. Even after I had gotten over the incident, I was still wary of him, never approaching the animatronic after the shows. The front door screeched open, disturbing a place that had been silent for years, and even I winced, as if waking up a dark force. I never can remember when the place closed. I just knew I stopped going suddenly, and my parents paled whenever I brought it up. Every time I searched it up when I was older, nothing popped up. It was like some deeply covered secret. Even locals wouldn't talk about it. When I brought it up, they tensed, and any former friendly conversations lost their friendly touch and turned more skeptical. I was planning on touring it anyway, but my true purpose was to discover the reason for Frizzy's wonderful circus closing. I walked into the building. Papers were scattered all over the floor, and the floor had a dark stain long dried on its surface. I concluded it was likely water damage, although it was fairly dark for water damage. The floor creaked under my weight as I walked along the flooring. I peered curiously into each room and even peeked at some of the papers. Most were far too old and damaged to even read, but the ones I could were nothing more than financial records. I pushed open a door to the stage area, and as I peered at it, nostalgia flooded my body. A little more rundown, but it looked nearly the same. I was peering around the stands when I heard the first noise. WW-. A robotic voice sounded out. "Welcome to Frizzy's wonderful LL Circus SS." I jumped into the air and whipped around to the stage where Frizzy was doing the screeching twirl he always did after the introduction. It was my first look at animatronics. Frizzy's ear was snapped clean off, metal and all. Half of his face was torn off, and one of his eyes dangled out of his socket. His two buck teeth were a rusty brown, suiting the rest of the metal on his body. A dark stain crept up his once soft fur, leaving it crusty. A shiver ran down my spine. The power wasn't on in this place. None of the animatronics should function, but Frizzy was. I crept down the stands where kids and parents alike sat for shows and over to the robot. I reached up a hand, ready to touch the robot, when it jerked again. Hello? Kids SS, ready YY to meet the C Crew WW. Are you ready YY for the S show WW? The voice stuttered out. The spotlights flickered on and revealed the empty parts of the stage where the other animatronics should stay. From another area, heavy footsteps were heard from behind me. I spun around and the footsteps stopped, and when I turned around, everything was still. I shrugged it off, excusing it as an electrical problem, the old system kicking in. I continued on the stage, the circus setting visible, the stand where Tigris usually stood. The ring hung above where Izzy usually hung. The large stone that Tigris stood upon. A false ring of fire standing near. A large snowy ski hill where Everest took her place stood empty. Dark stains spread across the floor in streaks like something was dragged through it. That thought chilled me as I realized how eerie this place was. For some reason, that didn't deter me, and I kept moving forward, intent on exploring my childhood place. The lack of the familiar animatronics didn't deter me. I only assumed they had been scrapped for parts and Frizzy was left because perhaps they couldn't remove him or some other lame thought. The next hallway led to the play area, a massive multicolored playground with many slides all leading to a massive ball pit. I had spent many hours in this thing as a kid, but a strange odor of something rotten floated out of it, causing me to gag. I continued forward, holding a hand over my nose as if that would stop the smell. I shone my flashlight into the pit, but nothing was there, and I certainly didn't want to touch it. All I knew was that some rat or something had died there. I didn't want to touch it. A scampering sound was heard from above, and I shone my light up to see something skitter by. I leaped back with a yelp before laughing at myself. It was most likely some rodent or wild animal. It did look a little bigger, though. I opened a door to a storage closet and let out a strangled scream at the sight before me. Sassy laid before me, or what used to be Sassy. Her long, fluffy fur was matted. The suit of her ear was missing, revealing the metal support below. Her legs were completely torn off, and she could no longer even stand. The same reddish-brown stain was spread across her, and she was lying in it. "Oh," I mumbled, kneeling down beside her. I reached out a hesitant hand before setting it down on her. My heart throbbed, but I closed my eyes for a moment. The animatronic suddenly jerked beneath me with a metallic screech. "WW won't you ever J just," Sassy began. "Shut up PP, Frizzy YY?" I laughed despite myself. It was her typical line during every show. The short-tempered sassy calico cat was always the heart of the show, besides Frizzy, of course. I got up, wiping my hands on my pants with a grimace. The rust-colored crust had come off on my hand in dust, a metallic scent coming off of it. The smell was familiar, but I couldn't place it, and I didn't care at the time. How I would regret that decision. I exited the supply closet, leaving Sassy to go through her routine with no one to see and unable to even complete it. In the next room was where I believe everything went wrong. It started in a dead silence, not even the creak of the building settling. The silence was broken by a screech, 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 screech. I whipped around and a scream tore its way out of my throat. The suitless version of Pogo, with his slightly too human eyes, stood before me, a snarl visible on his face. His teeth were daggers. His head jerkily tilted to the side. Blinking his eyes once, a stuttering sound was heard, and it took me a moment to realize it was a growl. One that was slightly too animalistic for an animatronic. It took one shuddering step forward, its mouth opening, revealing those razor-sharp teeth. That was when I bolted. I raced through the halls, dodging rubble and anything I could trip over. All I heard behind me was a thud, 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 thud. That was all that kept me going. I almost screamed again when I came across Sassy, hissing and furious, crawling across the ground, her eyes almost glowing in the faint light. I leaped over her, dodging her razor-sharp claws by an inch, stumbling on the landing. I picked up the pace, weaving in and out of areas. A figure crawling around on all fours approached. The orange and black fur of Tigris was noticeable. Her eyes were narrowed, and she pressed down, and I knew instantly what was going to happen. I dove out of the way as she leaped into the air, her claws slicing through nothing but air. I quickly scrambled to my feet and took off faster than the light I needed to get out. I got to the main stage, and everything looked near the same until I reached where Frizzy stood. The ringmaster was gone. The place where he stood held nothing. A metallic-sounding clink was heard from somewhere to my right. When I looked over, there was the rabbit, his face in a freakish smile that shouldn't be possible. He had a bouncing walk, almost like a skip but more rusted. He did a twirl before continuing onward, a laugh sounding across. Hello kiddo. Are ready for your RR special show WW? Frizzy stuttered out. I was not ready. I turned and bolted towards the door. I skidded to a halt when I saw Izzy and Everest standing in front of it, blocking it off. Everest's mouth opened wide and let out a screech. I covered my ears but bolted in another direction. A door I had not entered was visible to the side. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me and fumbling for the lock. I clicked the lock and turned around. I stared at the stairs in front of me and slowly descended them. This was the only place that was clean of the reddish-brown liquid, and at that point, I didn't even want to think what it was. Deep down I knew what exactly it was, but I didn't want to put it into words. To say what it was. Even if it was childish saying, it made it real. A makeshift file room stood before me, and by makeshift I mean it held 2 filing cabinets and then a few boxes on the floor. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the first file, flipping it open. July 15th, 1993. The makings of Frizzy's wonderful circus characters proved to be quite a challenge. Artificial intelligence just didn't get the characteristics we thought were necessary. We felt that we needed something more real, more intelligent. This is when we came to the idea of making it real, using something from the natural world to fuel intelligence. It started with experiments on animals, a rabbit, a border collie, a tiger, an elephant, and an Arctic fox. Then it evolved. We wanted them to be able to speak. So we decided to bring in parrots, but parrots can only repeat words. That was when the final experiment came into place. We would use humans. Of course, the human intelligence we used wouldn't be aware of it. We would ensure that, make sure it remained unaware enough that it never knew its true form. January 18th, 1996. The human mind is becoming too aware, but we are ordered to continue the experiments. Pogo's eyes are wrong, too human. They almost seem aware of us. The animatronics are acting odd. Their limbs move in more animalistic ways. They seem aware of their presence, aware they are alive. These files after that became unintelligible, so I moved on to the other files. They were news articles. December 23rd, 1992. Missing dog, Maximus, 2-year-old, Border Collie. Included is an image of a black and white Border Collie with blue eyes. Cash reward of $1,500 for any information. December 34th, 1993. Missing cat, Embers, approximately 4 years old. Included image is of a red and black calico cat sitting grumpily in the lap of a young kid who is beaming at the camera. Cash reward of $500 for any information. January 15th, 1993. 5 kids in the small town of Redacted were reported missing earlier this week after failing to return home from school. No traces of the kids have been found. Police are currently investigating the possibility of foul play but have hopes they are still alive. July 15th, 1993. Frizzy's Wonderful Circus is a fun world of play and a place where kids can be kids. An animatronic location has popped up out of nowhere in the small town of Redacted. A location based around a circus, starring Frizzy the rabbit, Sassy the calico cat, Pogo the border collie, Izzy the elephant, and Everest the Arctic fox. I went to flip to the next news article and another note fell out of somewhere in the pile. June 20th, 1995. A year before I stopped going to this place. The animatronics are almost normal. Too normal. I fear they are planning something. An uprising, a dash to freedom, something. No one will listen to me. They think I'm foolish. I know I'm right though. Something is off. Then a news article dated the year I stopped going. June 20th, 1996. Malfunctions in the animatronics at Frizzy's Wonderful Circus World have resulted in many deaths. The owner and maker of the animatronics have not responded, and the number of dead is currently unknown. A police investigation is ongoing, but the cause of the malfunction is unknown. I am currently huddled in the file room, unsure of what to do or how to escape. There is no service and no way out, and I fear they know. I had just finished writing this when the thudding began and the door shuddered from its force. The door won't hold much longer, but I needed to share the truth. The animatronics at Frizzy's Wonderful Circus are aware of their origins. They are angry. They want out into the real world, and when they do, I am terrified of the damage they will cause. They want revenge. For others to know their pain.